Toolbox Thinking and Law Thinking, Part 3. I suppose you could try very hard to never talk about a shortest path and only talk about alternative recipes that yield shorter paths. You could diligently make sure to never imagine this shortness as a kind of decreased distance in performance space from any shortest path. You could make very sure that in your consideration of new recipes, you maintain your ideological purity as a toolboxer by only ever asking about laws that govern which of two paths are shorter, and never getting any inspiration from any kind of law that governs which path is shortest. In which case you would have diligently eliminated a valuable conceptual tool from your toolbox. You would have carefully made sure that you always had to take longer roads to those mental destinations that can be reached the fastest by contemplating properties of ideal solutions, or distance from ideal solutions. But why? Why would you? I think at this point the toolbox reply, though I'm not sure I could pass its ideological Turing test, might be that idealistic thinking has a great trap and rottenness at its heart. It might say, somebody who doesn't wisely shut down all this thinking about shortest paths instead of the left-hand rule as a good tool for some mazes, someone who begins to imagine some unreachable ideal of perfection, instead of a series of apps that find shorter paths most of the time, will surely, in practice, begin to confuse the notion of the left-hand rule, or their other current recipe, with the shortest path. After all, nobody can see the shortest path, and it's supposedly a virtuous thing. So isn't it an inevitable consequence of human nature that people will start to use that idea as praise for their current recipes? And also in the real world, surely MSR law will inevitably forget the extra premise involved with the step from spatially shortest path to best path, the contextual requirement that our only important preference was shorter spatial distances so defined. MSR law will insist that somebody in a wheelchair go down the best path of the maze, even though that path involves going up and down a flight of stairs. And MSR law will be unable to mentally deal with a helicopter overflying the maze that violates their ontology relative to which the shortest path was defined. And it will also never occur to MSR law to pedal around the maze in a bicycle, which is a much easier trip even if it's not the shortest spatial distance. And MSR law will assume that the behavior of mortgage-backed securities is independently Gaussian random because the math is neater that way, and then derive a definite theorem showing a top-level tranche of MBSs will almost never default, thus bringing down their trading firm. To all of which I can only reply, well, yes, that happens some of the time, and there are contextual occasions where it is a useful tool to lecture MSR law on the importance of having a diverse toolbox. But it is not a universal truth that everyone works like that and needs to be prescribed the same lecture. You need to be sensitive to context here. There are definitely versions of MSR law who think the universal generalization they've been told about is a one weird trick that is all you need to know, people who could in fact benefit from a lecture on the importance of diverse toolboxes. There are also extreme toolbox thinkers could benefit from a lecture on the importance of thinking that considers unreachable ideals, and how to get closer to them, and the obstacles that are moving us away from them. Not to commit the fallacy of the golden mean or anything, but the two viewpoints are both metatools in the metatoolbox, as it were. You're better off if you can use both in ways that depend on context and circumstance, rather than insisting that only toolbox reasoning is the universally best context-insensitive meta-way to think. If that's not putting the point too sharply. Thinking in terms of law is often useful. You just have to be careful to understand the context and the caveats. When is the right time to think in law, how to think in law, and what type of problems call for lawful thinking? Which is not the same as saying that every law has exceptions. Thermodynamics still holds even at times, like playing tennis, when it's not a good time to be thinking about thermodynamics. If you thought that every law had exceptions because it wasn't always useful to think about that law, you'd be rejecting the metatool of law entirely, and thinking in toolbox terms at a time when it wasn't useful to do so. Are there laws of optimal thought governing the optimal way to contextualize and caveat, which might be helpful for finding good executable recipes? The naturally lawful thinker will immediately suspect so, even if they don't know what those laws are. Not knowing these laws won't panic a healthy lawful thinker. Instead, they'll proceed to look around for useful yet chaotic seeming prescriptions to use now instead of later, without mistaking those chaotic prescriptions for laws, or treating the chaos of their current recipes as proof that there's no good normative ideals to be had. Indeed, it can sometimes be useful to contemplate, in detail, that there are probably laws you don't know. But that's a more advanced metatool in the metatoolbox, useful in narrower ways and in fewer contexts having to do with the invention of new laws as well as new recipes, and I'd rather not strain MSR toolbox's credulity any further. To close out, one recipe I'd prescribe to reduce confusion in the toolbox inclined is to try to see the laws as descriptive statements, rather than being any kind of normative ideal at all. The idea that there's a shortest path through the maze isn't a normative ideal instead of a prescriptive ideal, it's just true. Once you define distance, there is in fact a shortest path through the maze. The triangle inequality might sound very close to a prescriptive rule that you ought to walk along AC instead of ABC. But actually the prescriptive rule is only if you want to walk shorter distances cateris paribus, only if you know which turn is which, only if you're not trying to avoid stairs, and only if you're not taking an even faster route by getting on a bicycle and riding outside the whole maze to the exit. The prescriptive rule try walking along AC isn't the same as the triangle inequality itself, which goes on being true of spatial distances in Euclidean or nearly Euclidean geometries, whether or not you know, whether or not you care, whether or not it's useful to think about at any given moment, even if you own a bicycle. The statement that you can't have a heat pressure engine more efficient than a Carnot cycle isn't about gathering in a cultish circle to sing praises of the Carnot cycle as being the ideally best possible kind of engine. It's just a true fact of thermodynamics. This true fact might helpfully suggest that you think about obstacles to Carnot-ness as possible places to improve your engine, say, that you should try to prevent heat loss from the combustion chamber, since heat loss prevents an adiabatic cycle. But even at times when it's not in fact useful to think about Carnot cycles, it doesn't mean your heat engine is allowed on those occasions to perform better than a Carnot engine. You can't extract any more evidence from an observation than is given by its likelihood ratio. You could see this as being true because Bayesian updating is an often unreachable normative ideal of reasoning, so therefore nobody can do better than it. But I'd call it a deeper level of understanding to see it as a law saying that you can't get a higher expected score by making any different update. This is a generalization that holds over both Bayes-inspired recipes and non-Bayes-inspired recipes. If you want to assign higher probability to the correct hypothesis, it's a short step from that preference to regarding Bayesian updates as a normative ideal, but the idea begins life as a descriptive assertion, not as a normative assertion. It's a relatively shallow understanding of the coherence theorems to say, well, they show that if you don't use probabilities and expected utilities you'll be incoherent, which is bad, so you shouldn't do that. It's a deeper understanding to state, if you do something that is incoherent in way X, it will correspond to a dominated strategy in fashion Y. This is a universal generalization that is true about every tool in the statistical toolbox, whether or not they are in fact coherent, whether or not you personally prefer to avoid dominated strategies, whether or not you have the computing power to do any better, even if you own a bicycle. I suppose that when it comes to the likes of fun theory, there isn't any deeper fact of nature underlying the normative ideal of a eudaimonic universe. But in simpler matters of math and science, a normative ideal like the Carnot cycle or Bayesian decision theory is almost always the manifestation of some simpler fact that is so closely related to something we want that we are tempted to take one step to the right and view it as a normative ideal. If you're allergic to normative ideals, maybe a helpful course would be to discard the view of whatever it is as a normative ideal and try to understand it as a fact. But that is a more advanced state of understanding than trying to understand what is better or best. If you're not allergic to ideals, then it's okay to try to understand why Bayesian updates are often unreachable normative ideals, before you try to understand how they're just there.